Welcome back to The Shadows. Before we uncover tonight's archived file, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never get lost in the dark. The testimony of Father Thomas Vance. The rain in late November did not fall so much as it hovered, a dense and suffocating mist that settled into the ancient oak timber of the Blackwood Ridge Chapel. For nearly 40 years, the small congregation nestled deep within the shadowed folds of the Appalachian foothills had lived in quiet isolation, insulated from the rapid march of the modernizing world outside. Father Thomas Vance had arrived at the parish in the autumn of 1884, a young man seeking quiet devotion and spiritual clarity after years spent amidst the crowded, soot-stained streets of Philadelphia. What he found instead was a community bound by unspoken silences, where the parishioners stared at the altar not with reverence, but with a lingering, guarded exhaustion that seemed to seep directly from the dark soil beneath their homes. The chapel itself was an austere structure, crafted from rough-hewn pine that had darkened to the color of dried blood over decades of relentless exposure to the mountain dampness. Inside, the air was perpetually chill, carrying the faint, bitter scent of stagnant tallow candles and old, decaying parchment. It was during his third winter at the Ridge that Father Thomas first noticed the irregularities in the parish ledger, a leather-bound volume that recorded the births, baptisms, and deaths of the valley's inhabitants dating back to the late 18th century. As he sat by the flickering hearth in the quiet rectory, the icy wind howling through the narrow gaps in the window frames, he began to cross-reference the ledger with the physical headstones in the churchyard behind the sanctuary. What began as a routine clerical task quickly evolved into a baffling and disquieting puzzle. According to the meticulous cursive entries made by his predecessor, Father Jeremiah, no fewer than 14 individuals had been buried in the consecrated ground between the years of 1860 and 1875. Yet, as Thomas walked through the overgrown graveyard, clearing away the wet leaves and thick moss from the cracked slate markers, he found that several of the graves bore names that appeared nowhere in the official registry of deaths. Even more disturbing was the discovery that 3 specific plots, tucked away in the furthest, most shadowed corner of the churchyard near the edge of the dense pine forest, bore no names at all, only a singular, deeply carved symbol resembling an inverted cross entwined with barren vines. The villagers themselves were remarkably reticent whenever Thomas attempted to raise the subject of the unmarked graves or the history of the chapel before his arrival. Mrs. Eleanor Finch, an elderly woman whose family had lived along the ridge for generations and who voluntarily cared for the altar linens, would invariably stiffen at the mere mention of Father Jeremiah's final years. She would quietly shift her gaze toward the floor, her weathered hands trembling as she smoothed the embroidered cloths, before offering vague platitudes about the harshness of mountain winters and the frailty of human memory. However, Thomas could not easily dismiss the strange atmosphere that descended upon the valley every evening as the sun dipped behind the jagged western peaks. The silence that followed was absolute, lacking even the familiar calls of nocturnal birds or the rustle of small woodland creatures in the underbrush. It was a heavy, expectant stillness, as if the surrounding wilderness itself were holding its breath, waiting for something ancient and unholy to emerge from the encroaching shadows. The first direct manifestation occurred on a Tuesday evening in early December, just as Thomas was preparing to lock the heavy double doors of the sanctuary for the night. The rain had paused, leaving the air thick with an oppressive, freezing fog that clung to the stained glass windows. As he walked down the central aisle, extinguishing the tallow candles one by one with a brass snuffer, a sudden, violent draft swept through the closed space, causing the remaining flames to dance erratically before vanishing entirely into pitch darkness. Thomas froze in the middle of the aisle, his heart hammering against his ribs in the sudden, total obscurity. Before he could reach into his pocket for his matches, a sound echoed from the direction of the altar, a soft, wet scraping noise, as if something heavy and soaked through with moisture were being dragged slowly across the cold flagstones. He held his breath, straining his eyes against the absolute dark, unable to discern whether the sound was approaching him or receding toward the sacristy. "Who is there?" Thomas managed to call out, his voice sounding hollow and remarkably small within the cavernous room. There was no verbal answer, but the air around him grew instantly colder, so cold that his breath plumed visibly in the faint moonlight that filtered through the high transom window above the entrance. Then, clearly audible amidst the silence, came the distinct sound of rhythmic, whispered chanting, a low, guttural murmur in a language he did not recognize, devoid of any Latinate cadence or familiar liturgical rhythm. It seemed to originate not from a single speaker, but from the very floorboards beneath his boots, reverberating through his bones with a sickening, resonant vibration. Terrified, Thomas fumbled wildly in the dark, his fingers finally catching the box of matches. He struck one against the rough brick wall, the tiny flare of yellow light illuminating the small radius around him for a fleeting second before a harsh exhale extinguished it. When Thomas finally managed to ignite the lantern he kept near the vestibule, the sanctuary was completely vacant. The heavy oak doors remained bolted from the inside, exactly as he had left them minutes prior, and the cold flagstones showed no visible signs of disturbance. Yet, the lingering scent in the air was undeniable, a pungent, metallic odor akin to rusted iron mixed with the foul stench of stagnant river silt. That night, sleep eluded the young priest entirely. He sat at his wooden desk in the rectory, the oil lamp casting long, distorted shadows across the log walls, as he searched through Father Jeremiah's personal journals, which had been left behind in a dusty trunk beneath the floorboards of the study. Up until this point, Thomas had respected his predecessor's privacy, viewing the old leather journals as personal reflections unworthy of intrusion. But the unsettling event in the sanctuary had shattered his lingering reservations, replacing professional courtesy with a desperate need for comprehension. The early entries in Jeremiah's journal, dating back to 1855, detailed the mundane realities of pioneer ministry. Long rides on horseback through treacherous mountain passes, modest harvests, and the simple spiritual needs of an isolated flock. However, as the entries progressed into the late 1860s, the handwriting grew increasingly erratic, shifting from a neat, disciplined script into a jagged, frantic scrawl that bled across the margins of the yellowed pages. Jeremiah spoke repeatedly of a dwelling beneath the altar, a sacred space that predated the construction of the chapel itself by decades, if not centuries. He wrote of strange dreams that plagued the entire valley, dreams in which the mountains spoke in voices of thunder, demanding a covenant of silence and blood to keep the ancient horrors of the deep earth from rising to consume the living. In an entry dated October 14, 1871, Jeremiah confessed to an act that chilled Thomas to his core. He admitted to sealing the subterranean chamber beneath the chancel, not to protect the church from the outside world, but to lock something inside that had begun to answer the prayers of the desperate parishioners during the terrible famine of that same year. The following morning, driven by a profound and disturbing curiosity, Thomas returned to the empty sanctuary equipped with a heavy iron crowbar and an oil lantern. The morning light filtering through the stained glass did little to dispel the gloom that hung perpetually over the altar area. Standing before the high wooden altar, Thomas knelt and began to inspect the baseboards, searching for any sign of a hidden latch or seam in the masonry. After nearly an hour of tedious searching, his fingers caught a subtle imperfection along the western wall of the chancel, a narrow gap concealed behind a decorative oak paneling. Inserting the edge of the crowbar into the crevice, he leveraged his weight against it until the wood groaned and cracked, giving way with a sharp snap that echoed like a gunshot through the silent church. Behind the panel lay a small, narrow stone staircase, descending into an absolute, pitch-black void that seemed to pull the very air down into its depths. The air rising from the hidden staircase was thick with the same damp, metallic stench that Thomas had smelled the previous night, accompanied by a freezing draft that nearly blew out the fragile flame of his lantern. Step by step, he made his descent into the darkness, his leather soles slipping slightly on the slick, moisture-coated stone steps. The staircase spiraled downward far deeper than the chapel's shallow foundation should have allowed, cutting directly through the solid bedrock of the ridge itself. As he reached the bottom, the flickering lantern light revealed a vast, natural cavern whose stone walls were lined with crude, hand-carved alcoves. In each alcove sat a wooden box, rotted through with age and moisture, exposing human remains that had not been prepared according to any Christian burial rite known to him. The skeletons were arranged in strange, unnatural postures, their skulls turned systematically toward a central stone slab that served as a primitive altar in the center of the subterranean chamber. Upon the central slab lay a heavy, iron-bound manuscript, its leather cover cracked and stained with age. Thomas stepped forward, his heart pounding in his ears like a muffled drum, and reached out a hand to touch the ancient book. The moment his fingers brushed against the icy leather, a sudden, deafening noise echoed from the top of the stone staircase, the sound of the heavy oak panel slamming shut above him, followed by the distinct, unmistakable click of an external iron latch slipping into place. Locked in total darkness beneath the consecrated ground of the church, Thomas listened in horror as the silence of the cavern was broken by the sound of faint, wet footsteps shuffling slowly out from the deepest shadows toward where he stood. The darkness beneath the chapel was absolute, an overwhelming and physical presence that seemed to swallow the fragile light of Thomas's lantern within seconds. The sound of wet, rhythmic scraping slowly echoed through the cavern, drawing nearer from the jagged crevices of the stone wall. Thomas backed away until his shoulders collided sharply with the icy, damp surface of the locked wooden hatch above him. His hands fumbled desperately along the frame, fingers bleeding as he clawed at the solid timber, but the latch held fast from the sanctuary side. From the shadows, the faint, guttering chant began once more, a chorus of dry, rasping voices that sounded as though they had not drawn breath in 100 years. As the light flickered, Thomas caught sight of movement among the rot-eaten alcoves. The skeletal remains were not stationary. Their delicate, brittle bones groaned and shifted under the weight of an unseen force, turning their hollow eye sockets directly toward the central stone table. In the center of the cavern, the ancient manuscript remained resting upon the wet slate. A sudden, violent surge of cold air rushed through the chamber, causing the lantern frame to rattle violently in Thomas's trembling grip. Driven by a desperate instinct rather than reason, Thomas took a step toward the altar, realizing that the manuscript was the singular focal point of whatever malevolent entity haunted this subterranean tomb. As his hand reached out to grasp the cold leather cover once again, the ambient air grew so profoundly chilled that frost rapidly bloomed across the brass casing of his lantern. The whispers grew louder, compounding into a deafening wall of sound that reverberated within his skull, echoing names of parishioners long buried in the churchyard above. Each name was accompanied by a terrible, explicit memory, vivid visions of desperation, secret sacrifices made in the dead of winter, and dark pacts sealed to keep the brutal Appalachian cold from claiming the settlement during the Black Winter of 1871. Thomas pulled the heavy book against his chest, feeling an immediate, sickening weight pressed down upon his heart. The moment the manuscript left the stone altar, the frantic scraping noises ceased instantly, replaced by a deep, hollow silence that was far more terrifying than the previous auditory onslaught. From the darkest recess of the cavern, a solitary figure slowly emerged into the pale circle of light cast by the failing lantern. It was clad in the tattered, mildew-stained remnants of a priest's cassock, its frame gaunt and stretched to unnatural proportions. The face was entirely obscured by decades of dried mud and black moss, save for two milky, sunken eyes that stared directly at Thomas with a mixture of profound agony and unholy hunger. Thomas recognized the silver pectoral cross hanging askew around the creature's withered neck. It was the very cross that belonged to Father Jeremiah, the priest who had vanished without a trace 15 years prior. The figure did not walk. It glided across the slick flagstones with a jarring, unnatural fluidity, its skeletal fingers extending toward the manuscript held in Thomas's trembling arms. "You should not have sought the records, young priest," a voice echoed, appearing to originate not from the decaying husk before him, but from the very air filling the cavernous room. The covenant requires a shepherd, as it always has. Thomas held up his wooden crucifix with his left hand, reciting the Latin prayers of exorcism under his breath. But the words felt hollow, devoid of any protective warmth against the oppressive malice of the chamber. The entity paused merely 2 paces away, its jaw unhinging slightly to release a cloud of freezing, sulphurous mist that extinguished the last flickering ember of Thomas's lantern, plunging the subterranean world into an unforgiving, subterranean twilight. The darkness beneath the chapel was absolute, an overwhelming and physical presence that seemed to swallow the fragile light of Thomas's lantern within seconds. The sound of wet, rhythmic scraping slowly echoed through the cavern, drawing nearer from the jagged crevices of the stone wall. Thomas backed away until his shoulders collided sharply with the icy, damp surface of the locked wooden hatch above him. His hands fumbled desperately along the frame, fingers bleeding as he clawed at the solid timber, but the latch held fast from the sanctuary side. From the shadows, the faint, guttering chant began once more, a chorus of dry, rasping voices that sounded as though they had not drawn breath in 100 years. As the light flickered, Thomas caught sight of movement among the rot-eaten alcoves. The skeletal remains were not stationary. Their delicate, brittle bones groaned and shifted under the weight of an unseen force, turning their hollow eye sockets directly toward the central stone table. In the center of the cavern, the ancient manuscript remained resting upon the wet slate. A sudden, violent surge of cold air rushed through the chamber, causing the lantern frame to rattle violently in Thomas's trembling grip. Driven by a desperate instinct rather than reason, Thomas took a step toward the altar, realizing that the manuscript was the singular focal point of whatever malevolent entity haunted this subterranean tomb. As his hand reached out to grasp the cold leather cover once again, the ambient air grew so profoundly chilled that frost rapidly bloomed across the brass casing of his lantern. The whispers grew louder, compounding into a deafening wall of sound that reverberated within his skull, echoing names of parishioners long buried in the churchyard above. Each name was accompanied by a terrible, explicit memory, vivid visions of desperation, secret sacrifices made in the dead of winter, and dark pacts sealed to keep the brutal Appalachian cold from claiming the settlement during the Black Winter of 1871. Thomas pulled the heavy book against his chest, feeling an immediate, sickening weight pressed down upon his heart. The moment the manuscript left the stone altar, the frantic scraping noises ceased instantly, replaced by a deep, hollow silence that was far more terrifying than the previous auditory onslaught. From the darkest recess of the cavern, a solitary figure slowly emerged into the pale circle of light cast by the failing lantern. It was clad in the tattered, mildew-stained remnants of a priest's cassock, its frame gaunt and stretched to unnatural proportions. The face was entirely obscured by decades of dried mud and black moss, save for 2 milky, sunken eyes that stared directly at Thomas with a mixture of profound agony and unholy hunger. Thomas recognized the silver pectoral cross hanging askew around the CR enveloped in the pitch-black void. Thomas relied entirely on his heightened senses, feeling the icy breath of the entity brushing against his face. Expecting an immediate and violent end, he raised the heavy manuscript defensively in front of his chest. To his shock, as the leather binding touched the shadowy presence, a violent burst of pale blue light erupted from the ancient pages, illuminating the entire subterranean cavern for a blinding second. The entity shrieked, a high-pitched, metallic scream that shattered several stalactites from the low ceiling, and recoiled back into the darkness. Taking advantage of the temporary reprieve, Thomas scrambled back toward the base of the hidden staircase, clutching the book with a desperate, white-knuckled grip. He ascended the steep, slippery stone steps blindly, his boots sliding dangerously on the mossy edges, driven forward by the relentless sound of footsteps pursuing him from the depths below. Reaching the top of the stairs, Thomas threw his shoulder against the wooden paneling that sealed the entrance to the sanctuary. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, he slammed his weight into the timber 3 times until the rusted external latch gave way with a loud screech of tearing metal. He tumbled forward onto the cold, hard flagstones of the main aisle, landing beneath the towering wooden altar as the hidden door swung violently shut behind him. Panting heavily, his body shivering uncontrollably from the subterranean chill, he immediately pushed a heavy oak prayer desk against the secret panel to seal the passage once more. The sanctuary was flooded with the pale gray light of early afternoon, yet the familiar sacred space offered no sense of comfort or security. The shadows in the corners of the nave seemed deeper, thicker, and distinctly watchful. Crawling toward the central aisle, Thomas spread the iron-bound manuscript open upon the altar steps to examine its contents under the dim, natural light. The pages were made of thick, yellowed parchment, bound with dark thread that smelled faintly of old blood. The text was written in a complex mixture of Latin and archaic English, interspersed with intricate diagrams depicting the surrounding mountain peaks and the ley lines intersecting directly beneath the chapel. As he meticulously translated the frantic entries made by Father Jeremiah during his final weeks, the horrific truth behind Blackwood Ridge began to unfurl before him. The church had not been constructed to sanctify the mountain. It had been built as a physical lock over a prehistoric altar where the early settlers had bargained with an ancient, primordial entity sleeping within the earth to ensure their survival through devastating winters. The price of the entity's favor was not mere devotion, but a continuous cycle of blood offerings concealed as natural deaths within the community. Every 15 years, when the winter solstice approached, a spiritual shepherd had to be bound to the cavern below to maintain the seal and feed the entity's hunger, preventing it from awakening fully and consuming every living soul in the valley. The ledger Jeremiah kept was not a record of Christian burials, but a tally of souls surrendered to the deep earth. Thomas turned the page and felt his blood run cold. The final entry in Jeremiah's hand was an uncompleted ritual intended for the winter of 1887, the current year. Below the instructions, written in fresh crimson ink that looked entirely unaged despite the passage of time, was a single, freshly inscribed name: Father Thomas Vance. Before he could react, the heavy double doors of the sanctuary slowly creaked open, revealing 3 tall, silent figures standing against the backdrop of the swirling mountain fog. The 3 figures standing upon the threshold of the church did not move with the hurried anxiety of men fleeing the bitter mountain storm. Instead, they stood bathed in the pale mist, their silhouettes framed by the towering iron-trimmed doors of the sanctuary like gargoyles carved into the stone itself. As they stepped forward, the floorboards beneath their boots remained strangely silent, yielding no sound despite the heavy leather soles they wore. Leading the procession was Mrs. Eleanor Finch, her usually frail shoulders now set in a rigid, unnerving poise, flanked by 2 elderly elders of the ridge whose families had held land along the valley since the first clearing of the timber. Their eyes, dull and glassy under the flickering gas sconces, moved in unison toward the ancient, iron-bound manuscript lying open upon the altar steps. There was no hatred in their expressions, only a terrifying, vacant resignation that chilled Thomas far more than any violent malice could have ever accomplished. "You should not have forced the latch beneath the chancel, Father Thomas," Eleanor spoke, her voice flat and stripped of its familiar gentle tremor, sounding like dry leaves blowing across a gravel path. "We brought you to Blackwood Ridge to shepherd our souls through the dark months, not to unearth the foundations that keep this valley alive." Thomas clutched the heavy brass crucifix tighter against his chest, his knuckles turning white as he retreated 2 steps back toward the altar rail, his heels catching slightly on the edge of the velvet carpet. He demanded to know the identity of the entity locked in the subterranean cavern beneath their feet, but his voice quavered slightly, echoing hollowly against the high pine ceiling. The elders remained unbothered by his holy symbol, taking another measured step into the nave, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the central aisle toward the dark sanctuary. Eleanor slowly raised a weathered hand, pointing a trembling finger at the open pages of the ledger where Father Jeremiah's final scrawl remained visibly fresh. She began to explain the cold truth of their lineage, that the original settlement of 1790 had not survived the brutal winters through faith or industry, but by striking an immutable pact with the hungry spirit sleeping within the bedrock. The church above had been constructed as a seal, a sacred cage designed to channel the entity's ancient slumber, but the seal required a continuous price, the life force of a consecrated servant of God every generation to keep the deep hunger satisfied. Father Jeremiah had not vanished into the wilderness. He had willingly surrendered himself to the dark chamber beneath the floor when his time came, ensuring 15 more years of protection and harvest for the families living along the ridge. Thomas stared at the three elders in horror, realizing that the entire community was complicit in this silent, terrifying cycle of sacrifice. He raised his voice, invoking the sacred authority of his office and commanding them to repent and break the unholy covenant before the darkness consumed their very souls. But the elders merely exchanged a slow, pitiless look before locking the heavy front doors from the inside, the iron bolts sliding home with a heavy, final clatter that sealed the priest inside the church with them. Out of the corners of his vision, Thomas noticed the air in the sanctuary beginning to darken unnaturally, as thick shadows bled outward from the edges of the walls and converged around the altar. The floorboards beneath the altar rail began to vibrate once again with that sickening, guttural hum, signaling that the entity in the cavern below was awakening, summoned by the presence of its appointed shepherd. The shadows within the chapel expanded rapidly, creeping up the tall, stained-glass windows like liquid ink and blotting out the remaining gray daylight from the outside world. The air grew impossibly cold, causing Thomas's breath to freeze into thick clouds before him as the gas lamps sputtered and died one by one, leaving only the dim, unnatural blue luminescence radiating from the open manuscript on the altar steps. Eleanor and the two elders knelt in the central aisle, their hands clasped in a parody of prayer as they began to chant the same guttural, rhythmic phrases that Thomas had heard echoing from the subterranean depths the night before. Their voices blended seamlessly with the vibrating floorboards, creating a terrifying chorus that rattled the brass candlesticks on the altar and cracked the glass inside the framed station of the cross mounted upon the western wall. Driven by a desperate impulse to survive, Thomas grabbed the heavy iron crowbar he had left near the chancel and lunged toward the tall, narrow stained-glass window overlooking the churchyard. He swung the iron bar with all his strength, shattering the depictions of St. John into a shower of sharp, colored glass fragments that rained down onto the snow-covered ground outside. Cold mountain wind rushed through the opening instantly, howling like a chorus of dying animals. But as Thomas reached up to pull himself onto the stone sill, an unseen, suffocating force slammed against his chest, tossing him backward onto the flagstones as if he had run headfirst into an invisible wall. The window frame was open, yet an impalpable barrier sealed the perimeter of the chapel, preventing any escape from the sacred enclosure once the ritual of the Vesper had commenced. Lying bruised upon the cold floor, Thomas watched in rising panic as the wooden panel concealing the subterranean staircase swung wide open on its own hinges with a slow, agonizing groan. From the pitch-black void below, a thick, freezing mist rolled out into the sanctuary, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of old blood and stagnant river silt. Out of the mist stepped the gaunt, elongated figure of Father Jeremiah, his milk-white eyes fixed unwaveringly upon his successor. The skeletal priest raised a pale, withered hand, gesturing toward the open hatch with a slow, rhythmic movement that seemed to drag the very air out of Thomas's lungs. The three kneeling elders intensified their chanting, their voices rising to a feverish pitch as the structural timbers of the chapel began to groan under the weight of an immense, unseen pressure descending from the roof. Thomas pushed himself up onto his knees, his eyes darting frantically between the approaching abomination and the open manuscript lying near the altar. He realized that the binding spell was tied to the physical ink and parchment of the ledger itself. The ancient pact relied on the continuity of names inscribed within its yellowed pages. Crawling toward the altar steps while battling the overwhelming atmospheric pressure, Thomas reached into his inner coat pocket and retrieved his silver matchbox. As the rotting hand of Father Jeremiah reached out to grasp his shoulder, Thomas struck a match against the rough stone step, holding the tiny, flickering yellow flame directly beneath the dry, brittle edge of the open manuscript. The entity let out a deafening, ear-splitting shriek that shook the very foundations of the chapel as the first corner of the dark ledger caught fire. The fire ignited upon the parchment did not burn with a warm, natural flame. Instead, the edges of the ancient manuscript curled into a deep, iridescent violet, belching forth thick plumes of black, oily smoke that carried the suffocating scent of burning bone and dry pine. As the flames consumed the names inscribed in the ledger, a violent, localized tremor ripped through the chapel floor, snapping the massive oak ceiling beams and dropping showers of dry dust and plaster onto the sanctuary carpet. Father Jeremiah's gaunt, animated husk recoiled instantly from the altar steps, clutching its withered head with skeletal hands as a terrible, unearthly shriek tore through its decayed throat. The physical tether connecting the entity to the physical form of its previous shepherd was violently fracturing, burning away along with the parchment that held the covenant together. The three elders kneeling in the central aisle collapsed forward onto the flagstones, their unison chanting dissolving into dry, agonized gurgles. Mrs. Eleanor Finch raised her face toward Thomas, her features contorted in absolute terror as the unnatural, glassy film faded from her pale eyes, leaving only the cold realization of what they had unleashed over decades of devotion to the dark mountain. "What have you done, Father Thomas?" she gasped, her voice raspy as blood began to seep slowly from her ears and nose, dripping onto the white linen altar runner she had tended for 40 years. "Without the ledger to hold the seal, the deep earth will consume the entire ridge. There will be no sanctuary left for any of us." Thomas ignored her desperate cries, pressing the burning manuscript against his chest as he stumbled backward toward the broken stained glass window. The oppressive, invisible barrier that had previously sealed the church perimeter was beginning to waver and thin, buckling under the raw, chaotic energy released by the destruction of the unholy contract. Beyond the broken window, the mountain fog had turned an unnatural, bruised purple, swirling in violent eddies around the silent slate headstones of the churchyard. Deep within the bedrock below, a massive sound, like the cracking of continental plates, echoed upward, threatening to pull the shallow foundations of the chapel down into the dark abyss where the ancient horrors slept. With a final, frantic effort, Thomas hurled his weight against the shattered wooden frame of the window, tumbling outward onto the freezing, snow-covered soil of the graveyard as a powerful explosion of cold force shattered the remaining stained glass above him. He landed heavily among the overgrown slate markers, the burning ledger still clutched firmly in his bleeding hand, its violet flames rapidly consuming the last remaining pages containing his own name. Behind him, the chapel structure groaned violently as the central steeple collapsed inward, crushing the chancel and sealing the hidden subterranean staircase beneath tons of shattered timber and heavy stone. But as Thomas pulled himself up through the freezing mud, he realized with a sickening dread that the silence had not returned to the mountain. From the dark line of dense pine trees surrounding the graveyard, dozens of pale, unnatural shadows were slowly creeping out from the forest. The snowy landscape surrounding the ruined churchyard seemed to twist under the pale, flickering twilight cast by the burning remnants of the manuscript. The silhouettes emerging from the dense pine forest were not men, nor were they the familiar fauna of the Appalachian wilderness. They were elongated, impossibly thin figures made of thick, liquid shadow, their forms shifting fluidly as they glided over the deep snow drifts without leaving a single footprint. Thomas scrambled backward through the mud and ice, his fingers numb from the biting cold, until his spine slammed against the frozen slate of an ancient headstone, one of the 3 unmarked markers bearing the inverted cross entwined with barren vines. As the shadowy entities closed the distance, The ambient temperature plummeted to a lethal degree, freezing the wet mud on Thomas's clerical collar into brittle sheets of ice. The lead entity paused merely a few paces away, its formless head tilting with an unsettling, mechanical curiosity as it observed the smoldering ash of the ledger in Thomas's lap. A chorus of overlapping, disembodied whispers filled the air, sounding like 1,000 dry leaves scraping across a stone floor, repeating the same wordless cadence that had echoed in the cavern beneath the church. Thomas raised his silver crucifix with a trembling hand, but the metal felt impossibly heavy, as cold and inert as a common stone. He understood then that the church had never been a holy house. It had merely been a gilded cage constructed to contain a primordial horror that predated the very concept of the cross. From the collapsing ruins of the chapel, a single figure stumbled out into the snow, its body badly bruised and covered in white plaster dust. It was Mrs. Eleanor Finch, clutching a heavy, iron-bound chest that had been hidden beneath the floorboards of the sacristy. A second volume, bound in faded pigskin that matched the original ledger in design. She looked at Thomas with an expression of cold, desperate resolve, raising a bone-handled ritual dagger in her weathered hand as she approached the circle of shadowy figures. "The covenant cannot be broken by fire, Father Thomas," she whispered, her voice carrying a terrifying, hollow resonance. "If you refuse to serve as the shepherd, the mountain will take the blood of the entire valley tonight. A name must be written in the secondary ledger before the midnight hour, or the earth will open and swallow Blackwood Ridge whole." Thomas watched in horror as Eleanor dropped to her knees in the freezing snow, raising the dagger to her own throat while chanting the final verses of the unholy vesper. The shadowy entities turned their gaze away from Thomas, converging around the kneeling woman as if drawn by an irresistible, magnetic force. Realizing that Eleanor was preparing to offer herself as a temporary substitute to appease the awakening horror and bind him permanently to the ridge, Thomas knew he had only seconds to make an impossible choice. Allow the horrific cycle of sacrifice to continue for another generation, or let the ancient entity break its bonds and destroy every living soul in the Appalachian Valley. As the blade caught the dim violet light of the dying flames, Thomas lunged forward across the snow to intercept her hand. The snowy landscape surrounding the ruined churchyard seemed to twist under the pale, flickering twilight cast by the burning remnants of the manuscript. The silhouettes emerging from the dense pine forest were not men, nor were they the familiar fauna of the Appalachian wilderness. They were elongated, impossibly thin figures made of thick, liquid shadow, their forms shifting fluidly as they glided over the deep snow drifts without leaving a single footprint. Thomas scrambled backward through the mud and ice, his fingers numb from the biting cold, until his spine slammed against the frozen slate of an ancient headstone, one of the 3 unmarked markers bearing the inverted cross entwined with barren vines. As the shadowy entities closed the distance, the ambient temperature plummeted to a lethal degree, freezing the wet mud on Thomas's clerical collar into brittle sheets of ice. The lead entity paused merely a few paces away, its formless head tilting with an unsettling, mechanical curiosity as it observed the smoldering ash of the ledger in Thomas's lap. A chorus of overlapping, disembodied whispers filled the air, sounding like 1,000 dry leaves scraping across a stone floor, repeating the same wordless cadence that had echoed in the cavern beneath the church. Thomas raised his silver crucifix with a trembling hand, but the metal felt impossibly heavy, as cold and inert as a common stone. He understood then that the church had never been a holy house. It had merely been a gilded cage constructed to contain a primordial horror that predated the very concept of the cross. From the collapsing ruins of the chapel, a single figure stumbled out into the snow, its body badly bruised and covered in white plaster dust. It was Mrs. Eleanor Finch, clutching a heavy, iron-bound chest that had been hidden beneath the floorboards of the sacristy. A second volume, bound in faded pigskin that matched the original ledger in design. She looked at Thomas with an expression of cold, desperate resolve, raising a bone-handled ritual dagger in her weathered hand as she approached the circle of shadowy figures. The covenant cannot be broken by fire, Father Thomas, she whispered, her voice carrying a terrifying, hollow resonance. If you refuse to serve as the shepherd, the mountain will take the blood of the entire valley tonight. A name must be written in the secondary ledger before the midnight hour, or the earth will open and the bone-handled ritual dagger gleamed with a cold, malignant luster in the dying light of the burning manuscript. As Thomas threw his weight forward across the frozen slush, his hands collided with Eleanor's outstretched arms, knocking the iron-bound secondary ledger into a deep snowdrift near the base of an ancient slate marker. The two figures tumbled onto the hard, frozen earth, breath hitching in icy gasps as the group of shadowy entities shifted in unison, their amorphous forms expanding until they blotted out the remaining stars in the clear night sky. Eleanor fought with an unnatural, terrifying strength, her fingers clawing at Thomas's face with fingernails caked in dried earth and tallow. "You fool!" she screamed, her voice cracking as a fresh spray of dark blood welled up from her throat. "The seal cannot remain open without an offering. It will take the innocent along with the guilty. It will devour every home from here to the river." Thomas managed to pin Eleanor's wrist against the frozen root of an ancient white oak, his chest heaving as the icy air scorched his lungs. He reached out with his left hand, grabbing the secondary ledger from the snow before the entities could claim it. The leather cover was wet and ice-cold to the touch, pulsating with a faint, sickening rhythm that felt terrifyingly like a human heartbeat. As Thomas held the book away from Eleanor, he realized the tragic scope of the trap. The ledger was not merely a physical record of names, but a spiritual vessel designed to act as a battery for the sleeping terror beneath the mountain. To destroy it meant releasing the primordial shadow upon the region, but to sign it meant forfeiting his soul and becoming a willing instrument in an endless, generational cycle of human sacrifice. From the collapsing rubble of the chapel's main chancel, a loud, sickening crack echoed through the midnight air as the subterranean chamber violently buckled. A towering fissure ripped through the frozen soil of the churchyard, splitting several headstones in half and exposing the deep, ancient bedrock beneath the chapel foundation. Out of the widening gap, thick streams of black, foul-smelling silt poured like a ruptured artery, accompanied by a deafening chorus of agonizing shrieks that vibrated through the very soles of Thomas's leather boots. The shadowy entities moved closer, their formless tendrils reaching out to envelope both the priest and the old woman, dragging them inch by inch toward the lip of the widening abyss. The cold had become so absolute that Thomas felt the skin on his face cracking under the bitter draft, his sight dimming as frost quickly coated his eyelashes. In a moment of sudden, desperate clarity, Thomas realized that the entity required a consecrated vessel, a shepherd who bore the sacred authority of the cloth, to validate the unholy contract. Eleanor's frantic attempt to sacrifice herself was a delusion. The dark force would never accept a lay person to fulfill the ancient covenant. Looking down at the secondary ledger in his hands, Thomas saw the unwritten parchment waiting for a signature in blood. He stared at the dying Eleanor, whose eyes were slowly rolling back into her head as the suffocating shadows enveloped her neck, and then looked toward the dark abyss yawning in the center of the sanctuary ruins. If he refused to act, the entire mountain would be consumed before sunrise. If he accepted, his soul would be trapped forever in the dark depths beneath the ridge. With the freezing shadows coiling tightly around his limbs, Thomas made his choice. He pulled the silver fountain pen from his inner coat pocket, the tool he had used to record mundane births and baptisms in Philadelphia years ago, and held it firmly above his exposed wrist. He did not intend to sign the secondary ledger as a willing servant of the dark entity. Instead, he planned to turn the ritual back upon itself using the sacred Latin rites of binding and excommunication he had studied during his seminary years. Pressing the metal nib deep into his flesh, he drew a line of fresh crimson blood across the yellowed parchment, using his own life force to write a solemn vow of binding rather than a surrender of leadership. As the blood soaked into the porous paper, a brilliant, blinding flash of golden light erupted from the center of the book, clashing violently against the suffocating purple shadows that hovered over the graveyard. The shadowy entities shrieked in absolute agony, recoiling away from Thomas as if struck by a physical wave of white-hot iron. The secondary ledger began to burn with a pure, radiant flame that consumed the leather and parchment without releasing any smoke or foul odor. Deep within the earth, the widening fissure groaned as the bedrock shifted back into place, the heavy stone slabs slamming together with a deafening thunderclap that sealed the subterranean cavern beneath thousands of tons of solid rock. The three shadowy figures dissolved into nothingness, leaving only the sound of the freezing mountain wind howling through the shattered pine trees. Eleanor Finch lay still in the snow, her breathing faint and shallow as the unholy trance finally shattered, leaving her an exhausted, broken old woman in the pale moonlight. Thomas fell to his knees on the freezing soil, clutching his bleeding wrist as the radiant light from the burning ledger faded into the quiet dark of the Appalachian night. The silence that followed was total, profound, and utterly absolute. The ancient, suffocating weight that had hung over Blackwood Ridge for a century had finally lifted, leaving the valley clean and cold under the winter sky. Yet, as Thomas pulled himself up against the ruined stone archway of the chapel door, he noticed something that made his heart freeze in his chest. In the center of his palm, right where the blood had dripped onto the leather cover, was a small, permanent burn mark in the shape of the inverted cross entwined with barren vines. The cavern was sealed, the secondary ledger was destroyed, and the immediate threat to the valley had been averted. But the mark was a silent, permanent reminder that the entity had not been destroyed. It was merely sleeping once more. As he looked back toward the dark forest surrounding the churchyard, he heard a single, distant whisper carried on the winter wind, calling his name from the deepest shadows of the ridge. The bitter winter draft that swept through the fallen timbers of the chapel carried with it no warmth, yet the oppressive malevolence that had weighed upon the valley for nearly a century felt strikingly diminished. Thomas knelt upon the frost-bitten soil, his left hand bound tightly in a strip of linen torn from his own coat to stanch the steady bleeding from his self-inflicted wound. Beside him, Eleanor Finch lay motionless against the stone foundation, her shallow breaths producing thin, fleeting wisps of steam in the freezing moonlight. The ancient pine forest surrounding the churchyard remained still and silent, no longer rustling with the unnatural, fluid movements of the shadowy entities that had emerged from the subterranean deep. The secondary ledger had vanished into a fine pile of white ash upon the snow, its dark power utterly dissolved by the binding ritual that Thomas had forced upon the ancient contract using his own consecrated blood. Slowly pulling himself to his feet, Thomas surveyed the destruction surrounding him. The roof of the chapel had collapsed completely into the nave, burying the high altar, the prayer desks, and the entrance to the hidden stone staircase beneath several tons of shattered timber and crushed masonry. The great fissure that had split the churchyard had snapped closed with monumental force, leaving only a jagged, dark seam across the frozen earth that closely resembled a scar upon the land. Yet, as Thomas walked toward the perimeter of the churchyard, his boots crunching softly in the fresh snow, he felt the heavy burden of his Pyrrhic victory. The entity had not been utterly destroyed. Such primordial horrors could not be erased by mortal means, but it had been forcibly driven back into its ancient slumber beneath the bedrock, deprived of the human shepherd required to sustain its active malice. Reaching the wooden fence that bordered the parish property, Thomas looked down at the palm of his hand, where the scorched mark of the inverted cross entwined with barren vines burned with a low, dull ache beneath his skin. The mark was not merely a physical scar. It was a permanent spiritual anchor, a brand that tied his soul directly to the mountain seal he had established. As long as he lived, his very presence would act as a living barrier, locking the entity in the depths below and ensuring that no further blood sacrifices would be demanded from the inhabitants of the ridge. He realized then that he could never leave Blackwood Ridge, nor could he ever return to the quiet life he had once sought in Philadelphia. He was bound to this lonely, frost-bound valley as its eternal guardian, trapped between the sacred calling of his faith and the dark secret sleeping beneath his feet. As the first faint lines of dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of bruised violet and pale cold gray, Thomas turned back toward the ruins of the sanctuary to tend to the surviving elders. The storm had finally passed, leaving the mountain wrapped in a clean, pristine blanket of white that concealed the dark horrors of the preceding night. Yet, deep beneath his boots, far below the solid Appalachian bedrock, Thomas could feel a faint, rhythmic vibration, a quiet, patient heartbeat echoing in the dark depths of the earth. It was a silent reminder that sleep was not death, and that time was a luxury the mountain possessed in infinite abundance. Standing alone in the freezing morning air, the young priest straightened his torn coat, raised his silver crucifix toward the rising sun, and prepared to face the long, solitary watch that lay ahead. Decades passed over Blackwood Ridge, transforming the quiet mountain valley as the 19th century gave way to the relentless progress of the 20th. The ruined chapel was never rebuilt by the villagers. Instead, the scorched stone foundation and fallen timbers were left untouched, gradually swallowed by thick briars, wild ivy, and the relentless march of the surrounding pine forest. The story of Father Jeremiah, the Dark Ledger, and the terrible winter of 1887 slowly faded into the realm of local folklore, spoken of only in hushed whispers by the older generations around hearth fires during the coldest nights of the year. The young families who settled along the ridge in later years knew nothing of the ancient pact or the horrors locked beneath the bedrock, enjoying decades of peace, bountiful harvests, and mild winters that seemed entirely disconnected from the valley's grim history. Father Thomas Vance lived out the remainder of his days in a small, rustic log cabin built at the edge of the abandoned churchyard, refusing every offer from the diocese to be reassigned to a larger parish in the city. To the local residents, he was a quiet, reclusive figure who spent his days wandering the overgrown perimeter of the graveyard, clearing dead leaves from the slate headstones and maintaining a vigilant, solitary watch over the silent land. Though he grew frail and weathered with age, his eyes retained a sharp, unwavering intensity that deterred curious onlookers from questioning his lonely existence. He kept no written ledger of his own, nor did he allow any new burials to take place within the consecrated ground surrounding the chapel ruins, effectively closing the churchyard to the living forever. On a freezing December evening in the winter of 1922, exactly 35 years after the night the chapel fell, an elderly Father Thomas sat by the warm hearth in his cabin, holding his worn wooden rosary in his trembling hands. Outside, a gentle, quiet snow was falling across the mountain, coating the ancient pines in soft white drifts. Looking down at his left palm, Thomas observed that the dark, burned mark of the inverted cross had faded over the decades into a faint, silver scar that no longer ached with cold malice. As the clock on the mantelpiece chimed the midnight hour, a deep sense of profound peace descended upon the small cabin, replacing the lingering chill that had haunted his spirit for over half his life. He felt the living seal beneath the mountain settle into a deep, permanent stillness, the ancient entity finally slipping back into an unbreakable, timeless slumber. When the local parishioners arrived at the cabin 2 days later to deliver winter supplies, they found Father Thomas sitting peacefully in his wooden armchair by the cold hearth, his hands resting quietly in his lap and a subtle, contented smile upon his weathered face. He had passed away quietly in his sleep, his long watch finally brought to an honorable end. They buried him at the edge of the pine forest overlooking the ruined chapel, marking his grave with a simple wooden cross that bore no elaborate epitaph, only his name and the date of his passing. The unholy covenant of Blackwood Ridge was broken forever, buried deep beneath the quiet mountain soil, guarded for all eternity by the faithful shepherd who had willingly traded his own freedom to keep the shadows at bay. If this file kept you awake tonight, leave a comment below with your thoughts, or share your own encounter. Until next time, pleasant nightmares.